In 1626, a Dutch colonial official named Peter Minuit stood on an island at the mouth of the Hudson River and completed what might be the most lopsided real estate transaction in human history. He handed over 60 guilders worth of trade goods, beads, tools, cloth to the indigenous Lenape people. In exchange, he received Manhattan Island, the entire island, 22 square miles of what would become the heart of global finance, home to Wall Street, the United Nations, and some of the most expensive real estate on Earth. Today, Manhattan's land value exceeds $1 trillion. But here's what makes this more than just a shocking bargain. The Lenape likely didn't understand they were selling the land permanently. In their worldview, land couldn't be owned, only shared. They thought they were granting usage rights. The Dutch thought they were buying property forever. This misunderstanding, this fundamental disconnect about what money could buy and what it meant, set in motion the displacement of an entire people and the birth of a global superpower. History isn't just shaped by battles and treaties, it's shaped by financial decisions, deals, policies, and miscalculations about money that triggered cascades no one saw coming. These aren't all the money mistakes in history. These are the ones that rewired the modern world, the ones that determined which nations would dominate and which would collapse, a bad bargain that handed over a continent, a desperate attempt to raise quick cash that created a rival superpower, a tax policy that sparked a revolution, a bankruptcy that ended a 1,000-year monarchy, a peace treaty that guaranteed the next war. Each time, someone made what seemed like a rational choice under pressure. And each time that choice unleashed consequences that killed millions, toppled empires, and redrew the map. Let me show you how the world you live in was built on financial miscalculation. After Manhattan, the pattern was set. When you need money, desperately, you sell the future cheap. And Europe's great powers kept making that mistake. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at a crossroads. He had just suffered a humiliating defeat in Haiti, where enslaved people had successfully revolted and destroyed French colonial ambitions in the Caribbean. His grand plan to rebuild a French empire in the Americas was dead. Meanwhile, he was preparing for renewed war with Britain. War is expensive. Napoleon needed money immediately. So he made a decision that would reshape world history. He would sell France's entire Louisiana territory to the United States. The Louisiana territory wasn't small. It covered 827,000 square miles, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. It represented 15 future American states, larger than all of Europe's major powers combined. Napoleon sold it for $15 million, less than 3 cents per acre. For Napoleon, this was strategic thinking. He couldn't defend the territory anyway. Britain controlled the seas. Better to sell it to America, get cash immediately, and deny it to his British enemies. But Napoleon completely failed to understand what he was creating. The United States, which had been a coastal power confined to 13 states, suddenly doubled in size overnight. The vast resources of the American interior, the farmland of the Great Plains, the gold and silver of the Rockies, all of it became American. For $15 million, less than Napoleon spent on a single military campaign, America acquired the land that would make it the dominant power of the 19th and 20th centuries. By the time France realized what it had given up, America was already unstoppable. Russia made the same mistake 6 decades later. In 1867, Imperial Russia controlled Alaska, 586,000 square miles. But Russia had just lost the Crimean War. They were nearly bankrupt. And they knew that if another war came, Britain could easily seize Alaska. Russia couldn't defend it. So they sold it to the United States for $7.2 million, about 2 cents an acre. The American public called it Seward's Folly, a frozen wasteland. For decades, Alaska appeared worthless. But then gold was discovered in 1896, then silver, copper, timber, and then, in the 20th century, oil. The Prudhoe Bay field alone produced over 12 billion barrels. Alaska became a major source of American oil and gave the U.S. a strategic position near Russia that proved critical during the Cold War. Russia sold all of this for $7.2 million because they were broke and scared. 3 fire sale deals: Manhattan, Louisiana, Alaska. What ties them together isn't just bad pricing. It's how financial pressure in one moment permanently shifted global power. The buyers, whether Dutch merchants or American negotiators, understood they were acquiring future wealth. The sellers only saw immediate relief from immediate problems. This is how the modern map was drawn, not through conquest, through desperate bargains. And it's how the United States, more than any other nation, consolidated the resources that would make it a superpower. Europe was selling the future. America was buying it. But money mistakes aren't just about selling too cheap. They're also about getting too much money and destroying yourself with it. Spain learned this lesson the hard way. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, and within decades, Spanish conquistadors were shipping home unprecedented wealth. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire, seizing gold. Francisco Pizarro destroyed the Inca Empire, looting more. But the real prize was silver. The mountain of Potosi, discovered in 1545, produced more silver than the rest of the world combined. Galleons carried 200 tons of silver per year back to Spain by 1550. By 1600, over 400 tons annually. King Philip II had more money than any monarch in human history, and he spent it all on empire. Spain fought wars everywhere simultaneously, against the Ottomans, against France, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against England, wars in the Philippines and Americas. By 1580, Spain had military commitments on 4 continents. The cost was staggering. Half of Spain's revenue went to the military. So Spain borrowed. And when they couldn't repay, they defaulted. 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596. 4 bankruptcies in 40 years, despite having the richest mines on earth. But the deeper problem was what unlimited silver did to the economy. When money floods your country, you stop producing anything. Why grow food when you can import it? Spanish nobility considered work beneath them. Manufacturing declined. Agriculture stagnated. The gold and silver arrived from America and immediately left to pay for French wine, Italian silk, Dutch goods. Spain became a conduit. Wealth flowed through but never stayed. And then came the inflation. All that precious metal drove prices up everywhere, especially in Spain. Spanish goods became overpriced and uncompetitive. The economy hollowed out completely. By 1600, Spain was producing almost nothing domestically, and when the silver mines began to deplete, the entire system collapsed. Spain lost Portugal in 1640, the Netherlands in 1650. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was a shell. The nation that had controlled half the world's precious metals went from superpower to secondary status in less than a century. Spain's silver killed Spain's economy. The greatest windfall in history became a disaster because no one understood that wealth without production is just temporary consumption. The money runs out, and when it does, there's nothing left. Spain's collapse shows something critical. Getting rich doesn't make you powerful, production makes you powerful. But while Spain was learning that lesson, Britain was about to learn something else, that trying to extract money from people who don't consent can cost you everything. After the 7 Years' War, Britain was victorious but drowning in debt. Parliament decided the American colonies should help pay for their own defense. Britain had just spent a fortune protecting the colonies from France. So Parliament imposed new taxes. The Stamp Act in 1765, the Townshend Acts in 1767, the Tea Act in 1773. These weren't enormous taxes. The financial burden was relatively light. But the colonists had no representation in Parliament, no vote, no voice in London. From the colonial perspective, this was tyranny, taxation without representation. They fought back, boycotted British goods, formed committees of correspondence. When Britain tried to enforce the tea tax, Bostonians dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor in December 1773. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, closed Boston Harbor, revoked Massachusetts' charter. This escalated everything. Within 2 years, shooting had started. Lexington and Concord in April 1775. By July 1776, the Continental Congress declared independence. Britain's attempt to extract a bit more money from the colonies had united them in rebellion. The war lasted 8 years. In 1783, Britain recognized American independence. Britain tried to save money by making colonists pay. Instead, they lost the colonies entirely, along with all future revenue, all strategic position in North America. A few tax stamps triggered the American Revolution because Britain forgot that money and legitimacy are inseparable. You cannot collect taxes from people who don't believe you have the right to tax them. Force doesn't change that equation. It just turns subjects into rebels. Britain lost America over tax policy. But that revolution at least produced a functioning republic. France's revolution over money would be far bloodier. In the 1780s, France was Europe's cultural superpower with the largest army. But the regime was broke. Decades of expensive wars, including funding the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. Kings Louis XV and Louis XVI spent lavishly on palaces while the finances rotted. By 1788, France's debt consumed 60% of government revenue just in interest payments. The government was effectively insolvent. Creditors refused new debt. But the structural problem was worse. France's tax system was catastrophically unfair. The clergy owned 10% of all land and paid almost no taxes. The nobility owned another 25% and paid minimal taxes. The third estate, everyone else, 98% of the population paid everything. By 1788, France was out of options. Louis XVI summoned the Estates General, an assembly that hadn't met in 175 years, hoping they would approve new taxes. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Third Estate arrived at Versailles angry and organized. They demanded real representation. When the king refused, they declared themselves the National Assembly and locked themselves in a tennis court, vowing not to leave until France had a constitution. Meanwhile, a bad harvest had driven bread prices sky high. People were starving, while watching their government collapse over money, and nobles lived in luxury. On July 14th, 1789, Parisian crowds stormed the Bastille prison. They killed the guards, paraded their heads on pikes through the streets. The French Revolution had begun. Over the next 5 years, the monarchy was abolished. Louis XVI was beheaded by guillotine in January 1793. Marie Antoinette followed in October. The Reign of Terror executed 40,000 people. The guillotine ran daily in Paris. The revolution became chaos, then dictatorship. Napoleon seized power in 1799, leading France into 15 more years of war. A regime that had ruled for 1,000 years ended because they couldn't fix their finances and wouldn't reform their taxes. France had faced this before. In 1720, France tried to solve debt with financial innovation. A Scottish economist named John Law convinced the French regent to create a bank and a trading company, the Mississippi Company, that would exploit colonies in North America. Law issued shares at 500 livres. Demand exploded. The price hit 18,000 livres by early 1720. Everyone in Paris was investing. But the company's actual profits were tiny. The whole thing was a bubble. In May 1720, reality hit. The price crashed. By December, shares were worthless. The French economy crashed. Law fled. The disaster left scars that lasted generations. The French public distrusted paper money and speculative finance. When the monarchy needed to reform the currency in the 1780s, people remembered the Mississippi bubble and refused. France's financial mistakes compounded across 70 years until the system exploded in 1789. The monarchy's refusal to make the nobility pay taxes, combined with decades of overspending and a population that no longer trusted financial reform, created a revolution that killed hundreds of thousands and unleashed Napoleon on Europe. Money isn't just money, it's legitimacy. When you lose the public's trust in your financial system, you lose everything. But the most catastrophic money mistake in modern history came after World War I, and it shows how financial decisions can guarantee the next war. In 1919, the Allied victors met at Versailles to write the peace treaty. The terms were punitive. Germany had to accept sole responsibility for the war. Germany lost 13% of its land. Germany's military was limited to 100,000 men. And Germany had to pay reparations, 132 billion gold marks. This sum was deliberately set to cripple Germany to ensure they could never threaten Europe again. British economist John Maynard Keynes warned that the treaty was a disaster. He wrote that demanding impossible reparations would destroy the German economy, impoverish German people, and breed resentment that would lead to another war. He called it a Carthaginian peace, meant to crush Germany so thoroughly it could never recover. Keynes predicted economic chaos and political extremism. He was right. Throughout the 1920s, Germany struggled to make payments. The economy was weak. Unemployment was high. In 1923, when Germany couldn't make a payment, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. The German government told workers to strike. To support the strikers and make payments, the government printed money. This triggered hyperinflation. By November 1923, $1 equaled 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled in hours. Workers needed wheelbarrows to carry their pay. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People used banknotes as wallpaper or fuel. Children built block towers with bricks of cash. Middle-class families, dressed respectably, surrounded by stacks of bills that couldn't buy a single meal. The inflation destroyed the middle class. Lifetime savings became worthless overnight. Doctors, teachers, engineers lost everything. They were angry, humiliated, desperate, and they blamed the Weimar Republic, the democratic government that had signed Versailles. The hyperinflation created a psychological scar. Millions of Germans associated democracy with collapse and sought order from anyone who promised it. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, promised to restore German pride, tear up Versailles, and rebuild the economy. The Communist Party promised revolution. The political center collapsed. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. By 1934, he was dictator. A nation that might have embraced democracy instead turned to authoritarianism because their financial system had been destroyed. And the crisis wasn't contained. When Germany couldn't pay reparations, France and Britain couldn't repay debts to the United States. American banks faced losses. International trade suffered. The instability helped trigger the Great Depression. In 1930, as the Depression began, U.S. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. The goal was to protect American farmers and manufacturers. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition warning Congress, it would backfire. They were ignored. President Hoover signed the bill in June 1930. Within months, 25 countries retaliated with their own tariffs. Global trade collapsed. Between 1929 and 1933, world trade fell by 66%. American exports dropped from $5.2 billion to $1.7 billion. The tariff didn't save jobs. It destroyed them. Smoot-Hawley didn't cause the Depression alone, but it helped choke global trade when the world could least afford it. The damage went beyond economics. In Germany, the Depression was the final blow. Unemployment hit 30%. In 1933, Hitler came to power, promising jobs through rearmament. In Japan, the Depression cut off export markets, and militarists used the pain to justify expansion into China. Versailles imposed impossible reparations. This led to hyperinflation, which destroyed Germany's middle class and enabled extremism. Smoot-Hawley collapsed global trade, worsening the Depression worldwide, which empowered fascists and militarists. The financial mistakes of the 1920s and 1930s compounded until the only resolution was total war. World War II killed 70 million people because peace negotiators demanded payment that couldn't be made, and lawmakers closed trade when the world needed it most. These stories aren't separate accidents. They're a sequence. When you sell the future cheap because you're desperate today, you create a rival. When you get rich but stop producing, your empire hollows out. When you tax without legitimacy, you spark rebellion. When you let debt spiral while protecting the rich from paying, your government collapses. When you demand impossible payments from a defeated enemy, you guarantee they'll come back for revenge. And when you close off trade during a crisis, you turn recession into catastrophe. Behind every decision was someone who thought they were being smart. Napoleon thought 15 million was worth more than Louisiana. He couldn't imagine American power a century later. King Philip thought silver was wealth. He couldn't see that production is wealth. King George thought colonists would pay. He couldn't imagine they'd fight. Louis XVI thought the Estates General would approve taxes. He couldn't imagine they'd overthrow him. Allied leaders thought crushing Germany would prevent war. They couldn't imagine they were guaranteeing one. Congress thought tariffs would protect jobs. They couldn't see they would destroy the global economy. And here's what matters now. We're living through our own era of financial decisions. The choices being made today about debt, about trade, about who pays and who benefits will determine what the world looks like decades from now. The lesson isn't to avoid making decisions. That's impossible. The lesson is humility. The men who made these catastrophic mistakes couldn't see the cascades they were triggering, which means we probably can't see the full consequences of our choices either, but we can recognize the patterns in what's already happened. Short-term financial thinking produces long-term disasters. Punishment in peace treaties breeds the next war. Closing trade doesn't protect economies, it destroys them. Printing currency to escape debt destroys savings and trust. Unfair systems that protect the powerful while squeezing everyone else don't just cause hardship, they cause revolutions. These lessons are written across centuries. Whether we learn from them is the choice every generation faces. So when you look at Manhattan's skyline, remember it started with 60 guilders and a fundamental misunderstanding about ownership. When you see the United States stretching coast to coast, remember Napoleon sold half of it because he needed cash for one more war. When you learn about the American Revolution, remember it came from a king who thought subjects would pay taxes forever, without a voice. When you study the French Revolution, remember it came from a monarchy that wouldn't make the rich pay their share. And when you try to understand World War II, remember it grew from a peace treaty that demanded too much and economic policies that closed the world off when it needed connection most. These weren't acts of nature. They were choices. And every one of them changed everything. The world you live in, the borders on the map, the power structures between nations, they were all shaped by financial miscalculations made by people who thought they understood money but completely missed what was coming. That's the real lesson. Money is never just money. It's power, it's legitimacy, it's trust, it's survival. And when you misjudge it, when you sell too cheap or demand too much or print too freely or tax without consent, you don't just lose money. You lose empires, you spark revolutions, you guarantee wars, you reshape the world. The question isn't whether we'll make financial decisions that matter. We already are. The question is whether we'll see the avalanche before it buries us.